People have been arguing about the visual style of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition basically since it was first announced, so I figured what better time to throw my hat in the ring than 3 months after it's been released, because I am nothing if not incredibly timely. And by that I mean I have tried to record this video multiple times, including the week of release. I just wasn't happy with the recording each time, so I kept redoing it and eventually putting it off until right now. So yes, I've said multiple times before that I like the way the characters look in Definitive Edition and just like the visuals of that game in general. So why am I still making a video about what I wish it looks like after it's been out? Well, fun fact for you all, you're allowed to like things, but not like them to the utmost and still wish they could be better or more to your specific tastes. So I have one of those, basically. But before we get into that, I need to give my usual run over of how character designs came to be in the original game, because people ask about that every single time I make a video like this. Basically, there was no character designer for the original Xenoblade 1. There were costume designers who designed all the different outfits, all the different armors would be on each character, but there was no one person or group of people whose art style was used to dictate the visual appearance of the game itself. So if you look at concept art of characters, depending on what outfit they're wearing in that concept art, they might be in a completely different style. And honestly, I think that's really cool, seeing the same characters approached in different styles by so many different artists, and how each specific person brings their own talents to design costumes that better suit what they're good at drawing. So that's nice and all, but how did you get from those costume designs in a bunch of different art styles that don't look at all like the actual game to the actual game? Well, basically, there was no character designer, so the modeling team just kind of did whatever. They knew exactly what the outfits were supposed to look like on these characters, and presumably the writers knew what the characters would look like in terms of their prominent features, like hair color, eye color, skin tone, relative height, and all that stuff. But basically the modelers just saw, alright, we gotta put characters with these features and these outfits, so let's just make a model in the limitations of the engine we're using that is able to touch on all those features and make them distinct in that way. So when I say that Xenoblade 1 doesn't have an art style, I'm not saying that the characters don't look consistent with each other and don't all obviously belong together in the same world. I'm saying that those appearances, which all fit together and have stuff in common, weren't derived from the work of a character designer designing them that way. It was effectively technical limitations that resulted in the modeling team putting together characters that fit all the necessary bullet points for what they're supposed to look like within the limitations of this very technically demanding game for the Wii. In fact, you can sort of see this because if you go back to the original Monado Beginning of the World trailer, the character models have a bit more polygons than they do in the final game, which is probably because they hadn't fully realized the biggest areas, so they were able to put more resources into the characters themselves. And you will notice that Shulk especially looks kind of a lot different than he does in any other appearance. Really, if I'm being honest, this is probably the second worst Shulk after Smash Ultimate Shulk. I don't know, this guy just kind of creeps me out. But then the developers got a chance to make Definitive Edition, and lo and behold, that's going to be on more powerful hardware, so we can add more polygons to the character models and make them look different than they did in the original game. So I don't think, as far as I can tell, that there was a lead character designer for Definitive Edition either, except for maybe all the new characters in Future Connected, but we can tell from developer notes that they basically approached the redoing of all the important character models, which needed to be done for Definitive Edition anyway to make it look good on the Switch, as this is how we would have made them if we had the polygons 10 years ago when we were making the original game. So basically, this is more faithful to the original idea of the characters, which can be seen in a few places actually. First off, they obviously fit in a lot more with characters from all the other Xeno games, even though they weren't designed by the designer from any of them, really. And no, Definitive Edition doesn't use Xenoblade 2's art style. Compare the two Shulks, they're completely different. It does use something much closer to Xenoblade 2's color palette, though, which dev notes have also confirmed. Yeah, we wanted to make it look a little more consistent with 2, and we're using a version of 2's engine, so color palettes more similar to areas and characters in 2 are used, but in terms of the characters' look themselves, it's much more this is what we wanted to do for 1 than we're trying to make them look like 2. What better way to see that then, but to compare it to the Xeno game that came right before the original Xenoblade, Xenosaga Episode 3. Personally, this might just be me reading too much into things, but I feel like the renders, especially of Definitive Edition characters, are the closest to Xenosaga 3 out of anything else in the series. Like, we could take Episode 3 Ziggy here, and we could take Definitive Edition Shulk here, just up the brightness a bit on Ziggy so his colors are a bit more in line with DE, and, well, yeah, you could easily convince me they were brothers if I didn't already have the context of knowing they're from completely different universes. So we've established the reasoning behind DE's characters looking a bit different, but that doesn't answer the question of what I wish they looked like. Well, in order to answer that, there's one more thing about the original game that needs to be brought up, and that is the official art of the characters. Usually, the character designer is the one who draws at least some of that, so what did they do? Where did all this official character art come from when there was no character designer to make it? Who drew this stuff? Well, the short answer is I don't actually know specifically, but the long answer is they had to get creative because they didn't have a character designer to make this stuff. Now, obviously, they could have just gotten one of the costume designers, all of whom are competent artists in their own right, to draw official art for these characters, but then they'd kind of run into the fact of, alright, we got these character models that look nothing like the art style of any of the artists who drew the costumes, so if they do the official art, it's going to be at odds with what the game looks like, and we're long past the point in technology where you have to use your imagination to imagine the character on screen looks like this art in your little player's handbook, so there kind of has to be some consistency there. Well, in lieu of a character designer, they got creative. They actually just drew over renders of the in-game models in order to make all this official art. And you can actually see this very clearly, especially if you take a look through the Monado secret files, because there's a bunch of this 2D official art that's just painted over character renders, and then there's other art that was drawn by other artists in their own style. Some of it looks a lot closer to the games than others, but you will notice that anything not drawn over a model is a lot more expressive than anything that was drawn over a model, and that's just because they're Wii models with not a whole lot of polygons, so they're not particularly expressive, which is another reason a lot of people like the DE models, because they were actually more detailed enough to the point where they had to go back and reanimate all the faces because they could emote more. So if you were wondering why a lot of the Xenoblade 1 official art has pretty non-dynamic poses and stiff-looking facial expressions with faces that look kinda wonky and big flat-nosed, it's because they were painted over models that were expressly designed to look good in Wii resolution, so even if you paint over it, if you're still tracing that original model, it's still not going to look the best in a much higher resolution. But there is one thing. The coloring and lighting style they chose to go with is miles better than anything that could have been done in the Wii game, and they did actually improve detail on that in a lot of respects, and I just really like the way it looks. I don't know the exact technical description for it. I'd say it looks a little painted to me. There is a very slight calligraphy brush motif going around in Xenoblade 1. The Xenoblade logo for that game is drawn in that, and that's obviously what the Monado art symbols are drawn in. So I don't know if it's a reference to that, making it look a bit more painted, but I just really like the way this looks, and wish they went with something like that for the character art for Definitive Edition, or perhaps even the entire game of Definitive Edition. Part of this is probably stemming from the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon remake, and how the visual style they went with for that was inspired by some of the official art for the original versions of the game, and how, while, yeah, it's still Pokemon character models from the past 3 generations, but some of them have their polygons taken out, but the background art is really good, and, well, Definitive Edition models were a lot more higher fidelity than those, so I kind of wish that they would have gone for, in terms of coloring and lighting, I guess this would all be part of rendering in terms of the way the characters are shaded and the models are colored. I wish they went with something closer to the style they went with when they made this 2D official art, just because I like the way it looks. Now, in terms of character appearance, would I like it to just be updated versions of the original models or reimagined the way they wish they could have made it? Well, I don't know if the DE style as it is would look as good with that filter over it. I think I'd still prefer it to up-res the original models with that filter over it. But personally, I think I'd like the DE designs as they are with that filter, but with a slight bend towards the Shulk and Fiora designs made by Kunihiko Tanaka, who is the character designer of Gears, Saga, and Xenoblade X. Now, I don't mean the Shulk and Fiora he made for Xenoblade 2, because those were more designed to fit in with the two characters and don't work at all compared to DE or anything else in 1, but this one piece of art he did for the original release, where, yeah, they look a lot different from the models, but they do look relatively close to, first off, a lot of Tanaka's other character design work. They look almost like proto-X characters, at least compared to his concept art for X, but they also look a bit more like the DE characters. So, combine the Xenoblade 2 color palette with basically DE but bent a little towards the Tanaka designs for the characters, and then with a filter or just a different set of shading guidelines over that to make it look like the Xenoblade 1 official art. Now, I don't think this would have been possible because they had a lot less resources than we all thought they did, making Definitive Edition, and as such, they basically had to go with cel-shaded models like they did for 2, but I can dream, and that's what I wish Definitive Edition looked like, even though I still do very much like the way it looks now.